Welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping into a really fascinating exploration today, pulling from a few different sources.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense topic.
It really is. We've got this comprehensive document called Blueprints of Awakening, which is just packed with these incredibly detailed architectural metaphors for enlightenment.
Buddhism's most dangerous question.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to analyze the core differences between two ultimate spiritual ideals in Buddhism. Specifically, the Arahant and the Bodhisattva.
Which is, a debate that has literally been going on for 2,000 years.
Yeah, and we're going to bust the common superficial misunderstandings about, selfish liberation versus selfless compassion.
And most importantly, I think, we are going to extract a highly practical framework you can use to spot the hidden traps of your own ego in everyday life.
Because it sounds highly academic at first glance, right?
Oh, totally. But it actually touches on one of the most fundamental psychological tensions we all experience, every single day.
Okay, let's unpack this, because you really don't need to be a monk living in a remote monastery to find immediate value in this dispute.
Definitely not. It applies to complete beginners just trying to navigate regular life.
To get us grounded, I want you to think about that moment on an airplane, right before takeoff. When the flight attendants are doing the safety briefing.
Right, the classic oxygen mask speech.
Yeah, they always get to the part about the masks dropping down from the ceiling, and the golden rule they repeat every single time is, secure your own mask before assisting others.
Which, it makes perfect logical sense from a survival standpoint. You cannot be of any use to anyone else if you are incapacitated.
Exactly. Yet almost everyone experiences a flicker of hesitation when they hear that.
Yeah, there's always that little voice.
I certainly do. There's this irrational part of your brain that thinks, wait, isn't that a little selfish? Shouldn't I immediately try to help the terrified kid sitting next to me?
And that hesitation, it reveals how deeply conditioned our social wiring is. We are often taught that immediate instinctual self-sacrifice is the ultimate moral good.
Right.
And that prioritizing yourself, even temporarily for a completely practical reason, is somehow a moral failure.
Like you're failing a test of character or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This exact tension, whether to save yourself first so you can help later or try to save everyone right now, is the beating heart of the debate we are exploring today.
Okay, so before we get into the intense philosophical battles and the historical drama, let's lay out the blueprints. What actually are these two paths?
Good idea. Let's start with the Arahant, which the texts define as the highest ideal in the Theravada tradition of Buddhism.
Right, the Theravada tradition.
The primary goal of the Arahant is personal liberation. It is structured as a very linear, direct trajectory out of suffering.
And the sources say the operational objective here is to systematically break what early Buddhism calls the 10 fetters. Let's slow down on that concept, though, because fetters sounds a bit abstract. How do these actually function?
Think of the fetters as deep-seated psychological chains.
Yeah.
Or like blind spots that bind a person to the cycle of rebirth and suffering, which is known as samsara.
So they are actual internal mechanisms keeping us stuck.
Exactly. We are talking about highly specific internal mechanisms. The lower fetters include things like the illusion of a permanent self, doubt, or, clinging to mere rules and rituals.
Okay, so breaking those first.
Right. And as the practitioner progresses, they have to break the higher, more subtle fetters, like the desire for existence in formless realms, restlessness, and fundamental ignorance.
Wow, so it goes deep. The Arahant path is basically the methodical dismantling of these chains until the mind is completely unbound.
That's spot on. It's about achieving absolute, unshakable freedom for yourself and stepping permanently off the wheel of suffering.
Okay, got it. Then, on the other side of this debate, we have the Bodhisattva, which is the foundational ideal of the Mahayana tradition.
Right. And the Bodhisattva's goal shifts entirely from personal exit to universal salvation. It's a very interconnected, sprawling trajectory.
Instead of aiming to exit samsara as quickly as possible, they do something completely different, right?
Yeah. The Bodhisattva makes a profound foundational vow to intentionally delay their own final liberation.
They actually choose to stay behind.
Exactly. They commit to returning to the cycle of suffering, lifetime after lifetime, until absolutely all sentient beings are awakened and saved.
Putting those two definitions side by side, it is incredibly easy to see how the stereotypes started.
Oh, for sure. The caricature practically writes itself.
Yeah. The superficial caricature paints the Arahant as this practitioner of cold, selfish detachment. Somebody who essentially says, I got my enlightenment, good luck to the rest of you.
While it frames the Bodhisattva as this perfectly selfless messiah, sacrificing everything for the team.
Which is a total flattening of both paths, right?
A complete flattening. It is crucial to understand that neither tradition recognizes those insults.
That's a really important point.
The core difference between the Arahant and the Bodhisattva is absolutely not about whether to have compassion or not. It is entirely about the sequence of compassion.
The sequence. That brings us right back to the airplane mask analogy.
It really does. The Arahant path basically argues, I must achieve complete clarity, stability, and liberation first, so that my compassion isn't tainted by my own ego or my own burnout.
Makes sense. Secure your mask so you don't pass out while helping.
Right. And the Bodhisattva path argues something quite different. They say, I will use my compassion as the very vehicle for my liberation. The work of helping others is the practice.
Calling the oxygen mask first person selfish completely misses the physics of a crisis. I mean, you can't rescue anyone from a burning building if you are currently on fire.
Exactly. You're just adding to the emergency.
But this is where the historical drama of our deep dive really kicks into gear.
Yeah.
Because the Mahayana tradition didn't just disagree quietly and go their separate way.
Did it not?
They threw a massive philosophical punch at the Theravada tradition. They basically claimed the Arahant path isn't necessarily wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete.
And they delivered this critique brilliantly through narrative. There's this famous Mahayana text called the Vimalakirti Sutra, which sets a deliberate, almost theatrical trap.
I love reading about this part, so dramatic.
It is. One of the main characters is Sariputra. And to understand the weight of this, you have to know that in early Buddhism, Sariputra is the living embodiment of the Arahant ideal.
Right, he's a huge deal.
He is literally the Buddha's chief disciple of wisdom. He is the absolute gold standard of monkhood.
Yet in this story, Sariputra is asked to go check on a layman named Vimalakirti who is called in sick. And the wisest monk in the world is absolutely terrified to go see him.
Yeah, he wants no part of it.
Which is wild. He is sweating over the idea of visiting a guy who has a wife, runs a business, and hasn't even shaved his head.
Well, the fear is justified within the context of the story, because the last time they spoke, Vimalakirti completely outmaneuvered Sariputra in a philosophical debate.
Just left him totally speechless.
Utterly speechless. And Vimalakirti is actually using his illness as a teaching tool, what the Mahayana tradition calls upaya kausalya, or skillful means.
Skillful means, right.
By feigning illness, he gets everyone to visit him so he can teach them. The entire text basically puts the ideal of individual liberation on trial.
By making Sariputra look kind of rigid and incomplete next to this unconventionally wise layman.
Exactly. The sutra calls the whole Arahant model into question.
They really didn't pull their punches. And the Mahayana texts double down with a metaphor from the Lotus Sutra that I found completely fascinating.
Oh, the Phantom City metaphor.
Yes. It honestly sounds like a concept from a modern sci-fi movie.
The Phantom City metaphor is designed to explain why the Arahant path exists at all if it isn't actually the final destination.
Right, like why teach it if it's not the end goal?
The argument suggests that the Arahant hasn't failed, but they have mistaken a rest stop for the finish line. Imagine an exhausted traveler on a brutal, arduous journey across a dangerous wilderness.
Okay, so they're trekking through a desert or something?
Yeah, and the traveler is at their breaking point, totally ready to collapse and give up entirely.
So a compassionate guide realizes that if they tell the traveler how much further they have to go, the traveler will just die of despair.
Precisely. So the guide uses that concept of skillful means again. The guide conjures a massive, holographic, beautiful resting place. A phantom city just up ahead.
A literal hologram.
Yes. It gives the traveler exactly what they need in that moment. Safety, rest, and a sense of accomplishment. The traveler recovers.
There's a catch.
A big one. The tragedy, according to the Mahayana perspective, occurs when the traveler decides to prominently settle in the hologram, refusing to complete the journey to universal Buddhahood.
Okay, I have to push back on this on behalf of anyone who has actually tried to meditate or achieve any kind of spiritual discipline.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
Isn't it incredibly condescending to tell someone that their ultimate spiritual enlightenment, the thing they spent decades dismantling their ego to achieve, is basically just a holographic rest stop?
It does sound a bit dismissive.
Right. Like, oh, look, you found the fake city we built for the tired kids. It feels incredibly condescending.
From the outside, it absolutely sounds condescending. But we have to look at the underlying logic of why they make this claim.
Okay, what's the logic?
The Mahayana tradition roots this critique in a universal interpretation of the Bodhisattva vows. Let's look at the first noble truth of Buddhism, which simply states, suffering exists.
Right, the fundamental diagnosis of the human condition.
The Mahayana tradition takes that diagnosis and pushes it into universal responsibility. Their vow becomes, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all.
So they scale it up.
Exactly. The logic is that if the fundamental disease is universal suffering, the cure cannot be merely personal.
That makes sense in a medical context, I guess. You can't just cure your own left arm and declare victory if the rest of the body is still infected.
Exactly the point. They view the frame of personal liberation as structurally too small for the reality of universal suffering.
Now, I don't want to leave the impression that the Theravada tradition just took this Phantom City insult line down, because they launched a massive counterpunch.
Oh, they definitely fought back.
As I was going through the materials, I noticed they point out a glaring historical anomaly in the Mahayana argument.
It is a devastatingly simple historical defense, actually. They point straight back to the foundational texts, the Pali Nikayas, and highlight the title given to the Buddha himself.
And what was the title?
The phrase used is Araham Samasambuddho, which translates to the completely self-awakened Arahant.
Which completely breaks the logic of the Phantom City.
It really throws a wrench in it.
If the Arahant state is just a temporary holographic rest stop designed for people too weak to finish the journey, why did the creator of the path give himself that title?
Right.
The guide supposedly built the fake rest stop, but then he moved in permanently. It just doesn't track historically.
It creates a significant historical paradox. Furthermore, the Theravada tradition argues that compassion was never a missing element that needed to be added later by the Bodhisattva vows.
It was already there from the start.
Yes. Early texts are packed with practices called the Brahma Vihara, which translate to the sublime attitudes: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity.
So they aren't ignoring compassion at all.
Not even a little bit. The Theravada argument is that genuine, limitless compassion follows personal liberation spontaneously.
It's like a natural side effect.
Exactly. It is the natural, effortless byproduct of an unburdened mind, rather than a heavy, infinite duty you have to vow to uphold.
But the most penetrating Theravada counterpunch isn't just pointing at history books, right? It's a psychological diagnosis of the people practicing these paths.
Yeah, this is where it gets really applicable to modern psychology.
I was completely captivated by the story of the Iceberg of motivation. It features a well-known modern Theravada monk named Ajahn Sumedho.
It's a fantastic story.
As the story goes, Sumedho is feeling incredibly resolute. He goes to his teacher, the great master Ajahn Chah, and confidently declares that he is determined to reach nirvana in this very lifetime and never, ever be reborn.
He is planting his flag on the highest, most pure Arahant goal.
It sounds like the perfect statement of a dedicated monk, doesn't it?
You would think a teacher would be thrilled to hear that.
But Ajahn Chah doesn't congratulate him. He just looks at him and asks, "What about the rest of us, Sumedho? Don't you care about who gets left behind?"
And the brilliance of that response is that Ajahn Chah was not rejecting the Arahant ideal. He was making a hyper-precise psychological diagnosis of his specific student in that moment.
So he saw right through him.
Completely. Think of Sumedho's motivation as an iceberg. Above the surface of the water, visible to everyone, his goal looked like pure, noble, spiritual renunciation.
But below the surface.
Below the surface, in the massive hidden bulk of the iceberg, Ajahn Chah saw total exhaustion. He saw a subtle form of cowardice, a desperate, reactive desire to escape a burning machine. It was essentially nihilism dressed up as spiritual mastery.
So the ancient path itself was pure, but the modern practitioner's motivation for walking it was deeply infected by a desire to simply run away.
Exactly.
That translates so perfectly to modern life. I think we all know someone, or maybe we've been this person, who suddenly claims they want to move off the grid, sell all their possessions, and achieve minimalist Zen.
Oh, absolutely. The digital nomad dream.
Right. But if you look closely, they don't actually care about minimalism. They are just severely burnt out and want a socially acceptable excuse to run away from their overflowing inbox, their massive mortgage, and their complicated relationships.
They aren't running toward peace, they're running away from stress.
That is a flawless modern equivalent. The ego is incredibly sneaky. It has hijacked the desire for spiritual liberation and weaponized it into an escape hatch.
Which brings us to a crucial realization here. The real danger in this debate isn't the path itself. The danger is the human ego getting involved.
It always comes back to the ego.
Always. And if the Arahant path has the ego trap of nihilistic escape, the Bodhisattva path has its own incredibly dangerous ego trap. And surprisingly, the Mahayana tradition's own texts explicitly warn about it.
Wait, their own texts warn against their own path?
Yes. To understand the trap of the savior, we have to look at the logic loop of the Bodhisattva. At the core of Buddhist philosophy, specifically within the Madhyamaka school of thought, is the concept of anatta.
Which is often translated as emptiness or non-self, right?
Right.
Emptiness can be a really tricky concept. How do they actually define it without making it sound totally depressing?
The simplest way to grasp emptiness is to realize it doesn't mean a void or nothingness. It means that nothing possesses independent, permanent, inherent existence.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of a wooden chariot. If you take away the wheels, the axle, the floorboards, and the yoke, where is the chariot?
There isn't one, it's just a pile of wood.
Exactly. The chariot is just a convenient label we apply to a temporary arrangement of parts. Humans are the same. We are a temporary arrangement of physical and mental processes.
So there is no permanent, unchanging self hidden inside the machine.
Right, there's no ghost in the shell.
I follow the logic of the chariot. But if I am just a temporary label and there is no permanent I, that creates a massive paradox for the Bodhisattva.
You see where this is going.
Yeah. How can an empty, non-existent self make an eternal binding vow to save infinite other empty beings across endless lifetimes if there is no I who is making the promise?
That is the exact tension. It seems like an impossible contradiction. To navigate this, the philosophical tradition relies on the framework of the two truths.
How does that framework operate?
It splits reality into two lenses. First, there is conventional truth. At the everyday lived level, suffering is intensely real, tears are real, poverty is real, and the Bodhisattva vows, I will not abandon you.
Okay, so that's the day-to-day reality.
Right. And second, there is ultimate truth. At the highest level of zoomed-out reality, there is no separate I, there are no separate others, and therefore there are no beings to save.
Trying to hold both of those truths in your head at the exact same time feels like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach while calculating astrophysics.
It really is a cognitive workout.
It seems like it would just break your brain.
Which is why the tradition introduces a safeguard found in the Diamond Sutra. It acts as a purifier for this specific paradox.
How does it purify it?
In the text, the Buddha instructs his disciple Subhuti, warning him that if a practitioner harbors the thought, I will bring sentient beings across to enlightenment, then they are actively harboring an ego.
So thinking you are a savior makes you fail the test.
Basically, yeah. They are clinging to the existence of a self who saves and a victim who needs saving.
Okay, let me make sure I'm getting this. You can only successfully save all beings by simultaneously realizing there are no beings to save.
You've got it.
The vow only works if there is no self making it. That actually reminds me of a quote from the materials by Ramana Maharshi.
Oh, yes, the Indian sage.
Yeah, he wasn't a Buddhist, he was a Hindu philosopher. But he perfectly diagnoses the flaw in wanting to save everyone before yourself.
It's a great analogy.
He says it is like a dreamer wanting all the dream figures to wake up before they do. It sounds incredibly noble within the context of the dream, but ultimately you are still fast asleep.
It's a brilliant analogy, and it raises a critical question about the dark side of the Bodhisattva vow.
Which is what?
Well, when the human ego hijacks the noble desire to save the world, what does it mutate into? It mutates into the Messiah complex.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me think about the mechanics of that. If your entire identity is built around being the ultimate selfless savior,
Follow that thread.
then your identity requires people to be suffering. The ultimate trap of the savior ego is secretly needing people to stay broken so you can keep playing the hero.
You've hit the nail on the head. The ego fundamentally needs to be needed. It craves eternal existence, relevance, and validation.
Wow.
And what better way to guarantee that you get to stick around in the drama of samsara forever than by assigning yourself an impossible, infinite task?
That is, wow. Under the guise of boundless duty, self-sacrifice, and compassion, the ego secretly ensures it never has to face its own dissolution.
Yeah.
That is deeply unsettling because it uses our highest virtues against us.
Okay.
So if we look at the board, both paths have these massive disguised traps.
They do.
The Arahant trap is nihilism, cowardice, and checking out of reality. The Bodhisattva trap is the Messiah complex, endless entanglement, and needing others to be weak. How on earth do we navigate this?
Well, the material suggests they aren't actually competitors at all.
What do you mean?
They are more like a mutual correction engine. I like to visualize them as two interlocking gears in an engine.
Okay, let's look at the gears.
The Arahant gear provides a necessary correction to the Bodhisattva. It protects the practitioner against compassion without liberation.
Got it.
It serves as a stark reminder that endlessly staying in the messy trauma of the world out of duty can quietly degrade into a simple inability to leave. It protects against toxic entanglement.
And the Bodhisattva gear corrects the Arahant by protecting against liberation without compassion.
Exactly.
It reminds the practitioner that if your freedom is framed solely as an individual exit strategy, then your enlightenment is ultimately just indifference.
This synthesis is beautifully articulated by the third voice in our sources, the Vajrayana, or Tibetan tradition.
What's their take on it?
They look at this 2,000-year debate over the sequence of the path and essentially conclude that the fast path of universal compassion only functions safely when the structural ethical foundation of personal liberation is already installed.
There is a vivid story highlighting this in the notes. A student asks a Tibetan Lama if the deity Tara, who represents the ultimate boundless compassion of the universe, actually exists.
Right.
And the Lama replies, she knows that she is not real.
That statement marries the two truths perfectly. You need both the boundless active ethics of the Bodhisattva and the absolute detached emptiness of the Arahant.
You act in the world with infinite compassion while simultaneously retaining the wisdom that it's all an illusion.
Exactly. Which brings us back to Ajahn Chah, the master who diagnosed the iceberg of motivation earlier.
His ultimate advice to his students cuts right through the whole debate, doesn't it?
It does. He told them, don't be an Arahant, don't be a Bodhisattva, don't be anything. If you are anything, you will suffer.
Because the moment you identify as the enlightened escapee, or you identify as the heroic savior, you are rebuilding the architecture of the ego.
You're putting the chains right back on.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
Yeah.
We promised a practical framework, so let's map this ego trap matrix directly onto your everyday life.
Yes, let's bring it down to earth.
Imagine you are managing a team at work. Or maybe you're navigating a really complicated family dynamic.
Something we can all relate to.
If you find yourself constantly overwhelmed, working 80-hour weeks, trying to fix everyone's problems, refusing to delegate, taking on everyone's emotional baggage, and secretly harboring this intense resentment that nobody appreciates how much you sacrifice for them.
Then you are falling straight into the Bodhisattva ego trap.
Exactly.
You are infected by the Messiah complex. You are likely using the dysfunction of your team or your family to validate your own worth and necessity.
So what's the fix?
What you desperately need in that moment is Arahant detachment. You need to stop trying to fix the hologram, set hard boundaries, and secure your own oxygen mask.
Yes. And let's look at the flip side. If you find yourself totally checked out at work, deeply cynical, and ignoring the struggles of your team because you've decided, none of this corporate game matters anyway.
Or people just need to figure it out themselves.
Right. And you are mistaking your apathy for some kind of enlightened boundary setting.
Then you are falling into the Arahant ego trap. You are infected by nihilism.
It's just a disguise.
Totally. You are using the concept of detachment as a convenient excuse for cowardice, burnout, or a lack of empathy. What you need in that moment is to reconnect with Bodhisattva compassion.
You need to remember that the suffering of the people right in front of you is real, and you have a responsibility to engage with it.
It requires constant, active calibration. You have to keep asking yourself, am I escaping or am I entangled?
That's a great question to anchor this. As we bring this deep dive to a close, I think it is fitting to return to the dramatic debate that started it all in the Vimalakirti Sutra.
Oh, the scene with the layman who feigned a fever just to embarrass the wisest monks.
Yeah. How does that philosophical showdown actually conclude?
It ends with a really profound scene focused on describing non-duality.
Which is what, exactly?
Non-duality is the state beyond existence and non-existence, beyond self and other, beyond binding and liberation.
Got it.
All the great bodhisattvas are taking turns, offering these brilliantly articulate, poetic descriptions of non-duality.
Like a poetry slam of enlightenment.
Exactly like that. Finally, after everyone has spoken, they turn to Vimalakirti. This is the man who has spent the entire text arguing, debating, and exposing the incompleteness of the Arahant path. They ask him to describe non-duality.
I can only imagine the speech he gave. What does he say?
He says nothing.
Wait, really?
Really, he simply remains completely silent. And the text declares that silence to be the most eloquent, perfect answer of all. The great debate ends the moment the ego's need to be right dissolves.
He utilized debate the entire time just to prove that the debate itself is empty.
Precisely. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawn from the tension in our source material.
Lay it on us.
When you look at both of these paths, I want you to ask yourself which one discomforts you more.
Ooh, that is a revealing question.
Is it the serene, final detachment of the Arahant that bothers you? Does the idea of completely stepping off the wheel feel cold, isolating, or selfish to you?
Or does the endless, unresolvable vow of the Bodhisattva make you squirm?
Right. Does the idea of returning to the mess of humanity forever feel exhausting, impossible, and overly dramatic?
Pay very close attention to that feeling of discomfort.
Because your discomfort reveals far more about the exact shape of your ego and your hidden fears than your spiritual choices ever will.
That is definitely something to sit with today. Whether you find yourself automatically reaching for the oxygen mask for yourself or immediately trying to strap it onto the person next to you, just take a second to ask yourself, who is the I that is reaching? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep checking your ego, and we'll catch you next time.